It was a misty morning, the kind that muffles the world in gray and makes everyone talk in whispers as if loud words might crack the sky. But down by the pier, an ancient wooden ship was making quite a racket. Captain Bartholomew, a wiry old man in a mismatched sailor's outfit, was wrestling with the ship's sails. "You stubborn canvas ghost," he muttered under his breath as the sails flapped and twisted away from his grip as if they had a mind of their own. A small crowd gathered, watching the bizarre spectacle of an old man being outwitted by his own boat. "Is he fighting the wind or the ship?" Someone snickered. "I think they're both winning," another added. Just then, Lila Dupree dashed down the dock, her arms full of mismatched luggage and her scarf trailing dangerously close to the splintered wood beneath her feet. She was late, as usual, a habit that seemed to follow her like an old friend she couldn't shake. Her hair, an untamed mess of dark curls, bounced as she tried to keep her bags from slipping. "Wait, wait," she called, half laughing, half breathless. Captain Bartholomew gave her a brief, exasperated look. "Hurry up, lass, or the Soul's vessel will leave without you." The name hit her like a splash of cold water. Soul's vessel. She'd heard whispers about it in artist circles, legends about a ship that sailed strange waters, carrying lost souls in search of something they'd forgotten. Some called it a ghost ship, others a miracle. To Lila, it sounded like a chance to get out of her rut. As she stumbled aboard, the ship gave a sudden lurch, tossing her into a pile of ancient-looking paintings stacked against the hull. Lila barely caught herself, tangled up in what looked like a very amateurish portrait of an octopus wearing a bow tie. She burst out laughing, the sound breaking the misty silence, and a few passengers chuckled along. "Quite the entrance," someone drawled. A tall man in a crisp, immaculate suit adjusted his tie with a smirk. He looked absurdly out of place, like he was waiting for a meeting, not an otherworldly adventure. Lila offered him a mock salute. "Just testing the floor. It seems solid." The suited man chuckled, and Lila could tell he wasn't used to laughing much. Just as she was about to ask him what had drawn him to this ship, Captain Bartholomew climbed onto a wooden crate at the front of the deck and clapped his hands. "All right, you sorry lot of lost souls," he bellowed, "listen up." The passengers, a curious bunch of mismatched individuals, huddled closer. They were an odd assortment, each with a story etched into the lines on their faces or the weariness in their eyes. "Welcome aboard the Soul's vessel, the finest, and only, ship capable of crossing the sea of forgotten dreams. You've all come here looking for something you've lost. A part of yourselves, perhaps. Maybe even your soul. And this old beauty," he gestured to the ship, which creaked as if to say, "Yes, I am indeed old," "is here to help you find it." A voice interrupted, raspy and almost insulted. "And what exactly is a soul fragment?" The question came from a tiny old woman with a bright purple hat and large glasses that made her eyes look like saucers. She had the air of someone who always found herself at the center of attention, whether or not anyone else agreed. "Ah, Mrs. Petunia." Bartholomew replied with a bow. "A soul fragment is a piece of you that got left behind somewhere along the way. A forgotten dream, a lost love, a stolen voice." "A stolen voice?" a young woman whispered with wide eyes. She was slim and pale, with haunted features and dark hair that framed her face like shadows. Lila noticed her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a notebook. Bartholomew nodded at her. "Yes, Miss Maya. Sometimes a voice is taken by fear, and sometimes by grief. But if you're brave enough, you might just get it back." Maya glanced around, seeming unsure but hopeful, her gaze lingering on the others for reassurance. Lila gave her an encouraging smile, feeling a kinship with the quiet woman. "And how do we find these so-called soul fragments?" asked the man in the suit, folding his arms skeptically. Bartholomew pointed toward the misty sea. The sea of forgotten dreams will guide us to them. You'll face challenges, nightmares, memories, whatever it takes to bring those fragments back to you. Lila swallowed. Challenges and nightmares? She'd thought this was a metaphorical journey, but the way Bartholomew spoke made it sound much more real. All right, then, Bartholomew continued, his voice softening. Everyone, introduce yourselves to each other. You'll be spending some time together, and you might just need each other more than you think. The man in the suit took a step forward and cleared his throat. My name's Derek Palmer. Well, he seemed to struggle for the words, and finally settled on, I'm a lawyer. Lila had to bite back a smile. He looked every bit the part, polished, tense, and just a little bit lost. Next was Maya, the girl with the notebook. She raised her hand in a small, hesitant wave, then wrote something down, showing the page to everyone. It said simply, Maya. Used to sing. Lila's heart ached a little at that. Used to sing. What had happened to make her stop? Mrs. Petunia came last, raising her chin proudly. I'm Petunia Elms. Widow, baker, and occasional card shark. I'm here to find my Frank. Bartholomew nodded approvingly. And what about you, lass? He looked at Lila Dupree, she replied, stuffing her hands in her pockets and shrugging. Artist, or at least I used to be one. A flicker of recognition went through the group, each of them understanding that strange, bitter feeling of once being something. Well, then, Captain Bartholomew said, slapping his hands together, let's set sail. With a jolt that sent them all stumbling, the Soul's vessel pushed off from the dock and glided into the mist. The world around them faded, the harbor disappearing as if they'd passed into a dream. The water beneath them became a dark, shifting mirror, reflecting not the mist but shadows, as if the sea itself was woven from forgotten memories. They'd only been sailing for a few minutes when the first wave hit. It wasn't water but something thicker, almost like oil, crashing against the sides of the ship with a sound that was more like a groan than a splash. Hold on! Bartholomew shouted, his voice echoing across the strange sea. The wave receded. Lila felt something shift in the air, a prickling, a presence. She turned and saw Derek, clutching the railing and staring wide-eyed into the water. His face had lost all color, his usual calm facade cracked open by fear. Derek, she asked, stepping closer, but Derek didn't respond. He was staring at something below the surface. Lila leaned over and gasped. Reflected in the water was Derek, not the one standing beside her, but a different version of him. This Derek was younger, wearing a paint-splattered shirt, with wild hair and a look of reckless joy. That's me, he murmured. Or at least, that was me. The image shifted, and Lila saw the young Derek looking defeated, his paintbrushes abandoned at his feet, his face lined with stress. Lila could almost feel his despair as if it were her own. This is your first challenge, Derek, Bartholomew said, his voice gentler now. The sea has shown you what you left behind. You must face it, or we can go no further. Derek looked down, his fists clenched. I gave up on painting years ago. It was a waste of time. Just a dream. Dreams aren't a waste, Lila said softly. They're the only things worth chasing. Derek glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a deep breath, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook. He opened it, revealing a pencil sketch of a landscape, rough but surprisingly beautiful. I keep it hidden, he admitted. I've been drawing, in secret. But it's foolish. Not foolish, Lila said. Brave. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Derek's face softened. He looked back down at the water, where the younger version of himself was now staring back with hope. Slowly, as if waking from a dream, Derek extended his hand toward the reflection. The moment his fingers touched the water, it shimmered, and he gasped, clutching his chest as a faint glow seemed to gather around him. When he looked back up, he was smiling, a small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. A hush fell over the group, and Lila felt a strange warmth in her chest, like a small piece of herself had been found, too. She looked at the others and saw the same awe on their faces. As the ship sailed on, the air grew heavy again. The mist thickened, and shadows seemed to move along the surface of the water. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, growing louder and louder until it was almost deafening. Maya clutched her notebook, her eyes wide. She scribbled something down and held it up. "Do you hear that?" The sound grew, a chorus of voices calling, echoing like a haunting melody. Maya's face went pale, and her hands trembled as she clutched the notebook tighter. She looked at Bartholomew with pleading eyes. He nodded, understanding. "Your challenge, Miss Maya. The sea is asking you to find your voice." She shook her head, fear written across her face, and Lila's heart broke a little, watching her. Maya had lost something deeply precious, a part of herself that she couldn't bear to confront. Lila placed a hand on Maya's shoulder. "We're here with you," she said gently. "Whatever you need." Maya's eyes softened, and she nodded, hesitantly moving toward the edge of the ship, where the water churned with ghostly faces, reflections of her younger self, singing with a voice that was beautiful and clear. Maya's hand trembled as she reached out toward the water. Her reflection looked back, a younger version of herself, eyes shining with the innocence and hope she seemed to have lost along the way. The singing in the air grew louder, a haunting, beautiful melody that tugged at everyone's hearts. Lila noticed how Maya's eyes were drawn to the younger reflection as if she was mesmerized by the girl she used to be. The Maya in the water began singing, her mouth moving with words they couldn't hear, but Maya's own lips trembled as if they might mimic the sound. Then the reflection held out a hand, urging her to join in, her silent words pleading for Maya to find her voice again. But Maya's hand stopped short of the water, hesitating, her fingers clenched in fear. Lila stepped closer, her voice low but filled with gentle encouragement. "You don't have to be perfect, Maya. Just let it out. Sing for yourself." Maya looked at Lila, tears gathering in her eyes. Then she swallowed, took a shaky breath, and opened her mouth. At first, nothing came out, just a trembling whisper. But then, from somewhere deep within her, a note escaped, soft and quivering, like a bird taking its first flight. She closed her eyes, and the note grew stronger, braver, filling the air with a haunting melody that wove together with the sounds from the sea. The reflection in the water smiled, a radiant, grateful look that seemed to fill Maya with strength. Her voice grew, filling the silence with a song that carried sadness and beauty, loss and hope. It was as if each note pulled a little piece of her soul back, gathering fragments scattered in the darkness. When she finally stopped, the mist around the ship shimmered, and the air felt lighter, as though her voice had lifted a weight from everyone's shoulders. Maya opened her eyes, breathless but smiling, her face transformed by a quiet, fragile joy. She looked at her hands as if they belonged to someone else, as if they'd been returned to her after a long time apart. "Thank you," she whispered, though her voice still shook. The passengers were silent, in awe of what they'd just witnessed. Lila squeezed her shoulder, sharing in the warmth of Maya's reclaimed spirit. Captain Bartholomew nodded approvingly. "Well done, Miss Maya. You've taken back something precious." Maya nodded, clutching her notebook to her chest, her smile wide and true. The group continued their journey, each of them feeling lighter, as though Maya's song had stirred something in their own hearts. The air grew warmer as the mist began to clear, revealing an endless expanse of calm, mirror-like water stretching out in every direction. Hours passed as they sailed in peaceful silence, each of them lost in thought, until suddenly, Mrs. Petunia let out an excited gasp. "Look!" she cried, pointing at the horizon ahead. They saw another ship, slightly smaller and anchored in the distance. It looked familiar somehow, as if it belonged to a dream they'd all had once but forgotten. Bartholomew steered them closer, and as they approached, Lila could see a figure on the deck of the other ship, pacing anxiously. He was an old man, dressed in an outdated sailor's uniform, with a face weathered by years of longing. Petunia's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth as she whispered, "Frank." The name came out in a reverent breath, a mix of disbelief and hope. She rushed to the edge of the deck, waving her hands and calling out, "Frank! It's me! Petunia!" The old man on the other ship turned, his eyes squinting as he recognized her. A slow smile spread across his face, and he raised a hand in greeting, his voice carrying over the water. "Petunia! By heavens, it's you!" Tears streamed down Petunia's cheeks as she fumbled in her pockets, pulling out an embroidered handkerchief she waved in the air like a victory flag. The two ships drifted closer until they were side by side, and Frank leaped across the small gap between them, landing on the deck with surprising agility. Petunia rushed forward, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce embrace. They clung to each other, laughing and crying, their reunion filling the deck with a contagious joy that made everyone smile. It was as if years of separation had melted away in an instant, and they were young again, lovers reunited after a long journey. "Petunia, my darling," Frank murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "I waited for you. All these years, I waited." Petunia held his face in her hands, her smile radiant. "And I looked for you, Frank. I knew I'd find you someday." They held each other for a long moment, lost in their own world. Then, Frank took her hand and led her to the center of the deck. "One last dance, my love." Petunia laughed, a girlish sound that took everyone by surprise. "Of course. I wouldn't miss it for the world." The two of them began to dance, a slow, swaying movement that seemed to belong to another era. Frank hummed an old tune, and Petunia closed her eyes, her face glowing with happiness. They moved together with a grace that defied their age, their love carrying them as if on a breeze. Lila watched, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She looked around and saw the same feeling mirrored in the eyes of the other passengers. This wasn't just a dance, it was a love that had endured beyond the boundaries of time and space. It was a reminder of what they'd all come here to find. When the dance ended, Petunia and Frank shared a tender kiss, their laughter mingling with the gentle sounds of the sea. Frank stepped back, his eyes filled with a peaceful light. "Thank you, my dear," he said softly. "Now, I can finally rest." With that, Frank's figure began to shimmer, fading into the air like a memory slipping away. Petunia watched him go, a single tear tracing down her cheek, but her face was serene, filled with the peace that only true love could bring. As the ship drifted on, Petunia clutched her handkerchief close, a symbol of the love she'd found and reclaimed. She looked out at the sea with a gentle smile, her heart full and whole once more. The mist returned, blanketing the ship as they continued their journey. The air grew heavier, and Lila felt a quiet tension settle over them, like a heartbeat beneath the silence. She knew her own challenge was coming, and a flutter of nerves stirred in her stomach. After a while, Captain Bartholomew came to stand beside her. "It's your turn, lass," he said, his voice kind but firm. "The sea has something to show you." Lila took a deep breath, steadying herself as she walked to the edge of the ship. She looked down into the water and saw her reflection staring back, her eyes shadowed with doubt, her mouth set in a tight line. But then, the reflection changed. She saw herself as she used to be, young, vibrant, filled with the unshakable belief that art could change the world. Her hands were smudged with paint, her clothes a chaotic mess of colors, and her eyes sparkled with the joy of creation. The young Lila looked up at her, disappointment flickering in her gaze. "What happened to you?" she asked softly, her voice echoing in Lila's mind. I don't know," Lila whispered, her throat tightening. She looked away, unable to bear the judgment in her younger self's eyes. She had been fearless once, unafraid of rejection or failure. But somewhere along the way, that girl had been lost, replaced by someone who doubted her own worth, her own talent. The reflection morphed again, this time showing her in a gallery, her work displayed on the walls. The pieces were beautiful, raw, filled with emotion, but she looked miserable, her eyes dull and lifeless. She saw herself turning away, abandoning her art out of fear that it would never be enough. Tears pricked her eyes as the memories flooded back. She remembered the moments of self-doubt, the crushing weight of expectation, the fear that her work would never matter. She had walked away from her passion, convinced it was foolish, a waste of time. "Why did you stop?" the reflection whispered, her voice tinged with sorrow. Lila clenched her fists, the weight of her regret pressing down on her. "I was afraid. I thought my art would never mean anything." The reflection reached out a hand, her fingers hovering just above the water's surface. "You never created for others. You created for yourself. That's what made it real." A rush of memories washed over Lila, the late nights spent painting, the thrill of putting brush to canvas, the joy of losing herself in her work. She remembered the feeling of freedom, of being truly alive, and a spark of that old fire ignited within her. Taking a deep breath, Lila reached out, her fingers brushing the water's surface. As she did, the reflection began to glow, its light seeping into her skin, filling her with warmth. She felt a weight lifting from her chest, the doubt and fear melting away, replaced by a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. When she looked up, her heart was lighter, her spirit renewed. She knew now that her art wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about the joy of creation, the freedom to express herself without fear. Lila turned to Captain Bartholomew, her eyes shining. "Thank you." He nodded, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "It was always within you, lass. You just had to find it." The ship sailed on, the mist thinning as they approached the shore. One by one, the passengers gathered their belongings, each of them changed, their souls a little brighter, a little more whole. As they docked, Lila looked around at her fellow travelers, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the journey they'd shared. They stepped off the soul's vessel, their feet touching solid ground, but each of them carried something intangible, a piece of themselves they'd thought lost forever. As the sun rose on the horizon, Captain Bartholomew gave them a final salute. "May you find what you seek, wherever the journey takes you." And with that, the soul's vessel disappeared into the mist, leaving them to carry their newfound courage and hope into the world beyond. Lila watched the ship fade, her heart full of possibility, ready to embrace the life she'd left behind, and the art that was, once again, her soul's true vessel. End of story.